This podcast has reached a milestone, and it's time to celebrate and also to talk about what happens next with this podcast. We're going to talk about all of that next. Hello, and welcome to episode 100. This is the Musician Toolkit. My name is David Lane. I'm your host, and it is great to be with you once again. So with this being a milestone episode, today's topic is about the podcast itself. I want to just celebrate it for a little bit before I then talk about kind of my plans for the podcast going forward. But I just want to start by saying that I'm very proud that I have been able to maintain the commitment to get this podcast episode 100, and that I did so in 99 weeks, because there was that one time in the month of May last year, 2023, that we had a special Thursday episode because it happened to be May the 4th, and it was a Star Wars episode related to talking about the film score for The Empire Strikes Back. And so that was a 2-episode week. So again, we've done 100 episodes now, and this is the 99th week of the podcast. It began on January 2nd, 2023, and we have not missed a single Monday, not even given that Christmas Day of 2023 and New Year's Day of 2024 fell on a Monday. So just in case this is your first episode, or you haven't caught a lot of episodes, like maybe you haven't, listened to the ones in the very beginning of this podcast, let's recap what is the basis of this podcast. And what it has been is that to be a good musician, you need a good toolkit. And that toolkit needs a lot of tools. And they're ones that you don't go buy at Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever. They're ones that you develop. You develop in the practice room, you develop in the classroom, you develop by reading books, you develop through experience. And it took a couple of different episodes to come up with the tools, and it's 21 and counting so far. But those tools are the skill of sight reading, a well-developed ear, the ability to transpose, the ability to improvise, the ability to compose, the ability to practice well, the ability to play any rhythm, and I've kind of been more specific, the ability to play any written rhythm, mastery of one instrument, experience with other instruments, the ability to sing, knowledge of the piano, knowledge of music theory, knowledge of music history, the ability to follow other musicians, the ability to play in many styles, experience with conducting, experience with studio production, and kind of a offshoot of that is experience with music technology, the ability to teach, the ability to memorize music, for professionals, basic business and marketing skills, and the ability to listen analytically. And I feel like we have covered all of that pretty well so far. Kind of racking my brain to think of how much we've talked about following other musicians, so kind of like the aspect of being an accompanist. I think it's come up, but we probably haven't devoted as much time to that one as some of the others. But those are the tools that I have encouraged you to develop, to look at where maybe you're lacking, and that by taking care of that weakness or taking care of that shortcoming, you will make yourself a stronger, more complete musician. Because I believe that there's a strong, almost a compound effect, a cumulative effect, that the more strong skills you have, it's more of it's not really addition, it's multiplication. You become a much stronger musician when you have all of these tools in your toolkit. Okay, so 100 episodes. I want to go through just a couple of categories here. The first category is I want to just highlight a few episodes that I am particularly pleased with, that the numbers say that not as many of you checked out. So I'm going to go over these. Some of these episode numbers are in the title, but I'll give the date that they came out just to help you find them as well. So the first one was episode 7, the Overtone series, what it is and why you should know it. It's a very geeky episode, and actually I do cringe a little bit when I listen to it now, just in hearing myself speak, because I think I've become a better host since these early episodes. But I really think I did a pretty good job of explaining this complicated topic and that all musicians should be aware of, but sometimes you get the glazed look in the eyes when they talk about it because it's really a topic of physics. This is one that if you have an access to YouTube, if you'd rather go watch it there, I did do visual elements on this episode, so it probably is better as a video podcast. That was episode 7. That came out on February 6th, 2023. The next one that I would recommend is episode 13. Again, these are episodes that I think were really helpful and not only helpful, but fit into the continued theme of this podcast, that where the numbers are just a little lower compared to some of the other episodes. So episode 13 is called Listening Approach for Classical versus Non-Classical Music, and it came out on March 20th, 2023. And this is where I talked about there's a different way to explore what you're listening to in various genres of music. And this is also where the 21st tool of listening analytically came from. Listening is an important skill, and I do think that everybody can benefit in some way or another from what we talked about on that episode. So that was episode 13, Listening Approach for Classical versus Non-Classical Music. It came out on March 20th, 2023. I'd also recommend checking out The Residual Effects of Practice. This was episode 19. Came out May 1st, 2023. This is where I just talked about the power of how when you work on something well, it's going to come in handy, not just for the time that you practiced it, but for other things down the road when you need it. So it's a great way to think about practice and how all the work you put in is worth it, but not just for that moment. So check that out, The Residual Effects of Practice, episode 19. If you're a composer, you really should check out episode 28, which featured a guest. It featured Daniel Kuntz. We talked about composing for the harp. It's more difficult than you think, and a lot of things are not covered in textbooks. And we talked about quite a bit on that episode. That came out on June 26th, 2023. Another one with a guest that was an example of an episode that went different than how I thought it was going to go. And I thought that the guest was very insightful and had a lot of just great tidbits one after another that, really doesn't have as many listeners as some of the other ones. And that is called Producing an Album and Continuing Education with Connor Chairland, episode 48. Connor is a guy, he had recently done an album. I think it was his debut album. And we talked about that, but he lives in Los Angeles, and he was not a musician until 7 years before our interview. And he talks about the things that he was able to use to get some success and get it fairly quickly, in a place like Los Angeles. And his insight is just very good. So I would definitely recommend you check that out. That came out November 13th, 2023, episode 48, Producing an Album and Continuing Education with Connor Chairland. Everybody should be checking out episode 57. This is called Physical Wellness for Musicians with Angela McCuston. She is a personal trainer, but also a professional flutist, and has worked for several years with musicians on all kinds of injuries and also teaching how to prevent injuries. It's the second time I've interviewed her, because I also interviewed her for my Life in the Pit podcast, and she's very insightful, and I definitely highly recommend checking out that episode. It came out on January 15th of this year, 2024. On episode 65, I talked with Dr. Ronald Ford about just approaching and learning different instruments, and he has a lot of good insight for how to approach learning different instruments, because he's someone who plays basically everything that's not a brass instrument. He plays all of the woodwinds, all of the strings. Well, I guess some of the percussion, but also some piano as well. He has his own channel where he basically does his own orchestral covers, where he's playing like all the parts of an orchestra. That's episode 65. It came out on March 11th, 2024. And then just one more I'll mention, came out on July 8th, 2024. This episode did really well. Well, I mean, this episode did, at least average, if not slightly above average, on podcast numbers. but it's one of my lowest viewed episodes on YouTube by like pretty big margin. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's called Problem Solving in the Practice Room with Dr. Larry Wang. And it's just one of my favorite interviews that I've had with a guest. Definitely, I think if I was to rank them, it's one of my top 5 favorites. And some really brilliant insights from that episode. And this was not, I wasn't numbering the episodes at this point, but this is called Problem Solving in the Practice Room with Dr. Larry Wang. I think this is like, here it is, episode 82. And it came out on July 8th, 2024. Okay, so I have another celebration topic that I'm going to talk about in just a moment, but let's talk about some changes, some things that are going to be a little bit different about this podcast going forward. So the first change, the first announcement I need to make with you is the podcast is going to continue, but it's not going to continue in 2024. I'm going to take a break after this episode for the remainder of 2024. But I fully intend to bring back the next episode to resume with episode 101 in January. So that's the first thing. So this episode's coming out on November 11th. This will be the last episode of this podcast until at some point in January, not too long into January. Probably won't be the first Monday of the year. And I'm not even positive if I'm going to keep it on Monday. I probably will. But there's some more important announcements. The next thing is I'm going to be changing the name of the podcast. So instead of the Musician Toolkit, the podcast going forward, starting with episode 101, so starting in 2025, this podcast will be called Musicianship Mastery. So let me talk about why the name change and what that implies with the podcast going forward. So one thing I loved about having 20 and then eventually 21 tools is it just gave me no end of topics to talk about. But at some point I realized that what I really wanted to do was talk about what all of these tools are doing, and that is creating musicianship, strengthening your overall musicianship. And there's just a lot of episodes that I've done that really don't talk about that much. They talk about other things, but they don't really hit the point of becoming a better musician. So I'm going to continue to talk about all of these tools, but I probably am going to be more focused all on the episodes that I do of making sure that it ties into how this makes you a better musician, not just the tool itself. So right away, this is going to become less of a tools-focused podcast and more centered on musicianship itself, how to improve it and how to master it. If I just kind of look at recent episodes, so like maybe the last couple of dozen episodes that we've done here, if I think about like what are examples of episodes that are going to be similar to the ones that we go on with, I would say the episode that I had with Bob Moore talking about getting started with a new church music job. It came out on October 14th. That is certainly one, as is the one, the several before that. 4 types of books every composer should own. Came out on October 7th. The week before that, music notation apps in a post-finale world. Again, maybe with more of a focus on the musicianship aspect, but it is things that musicians need to have. And then especially what I had a lot of before then, the 4 core performance skills. And this was the series that kind of really got me thinking about the direction I want the podcast to go. And when I started thinking about, yes, there's 21 skills that you need as a musician, the way I've counted them, but there's 4 core skills that just as a performing musician, it will change so much about what is possible for you. So I'm going to be revisiting those 4 core performance skills as we go on. I was incorrect. The episode with Bob Moore came out on September 2nd, The Tools of Church Music Directing. And the episode that I mentioned earlier, Problem Solving in the Practice Room with Dr. Larry Wang, that came out on July 8th, that is definitely something that we'll be doing more of. And all the episodes that I've talked about that involved practice skills or theory lessons or composing lessons. So I'll definitely continue to have some things about that. Okay, so what are the types of episodes that I'm not going to be doing as much of anymore, or may not even really be doing at all? Because one of the reasons for this rebrand is I wanted to get myself focused and to be a little bit less broad and a little bit more niche. So I'm going to be talking less about genres of music. So there are some episodes that I enjoyed. I talked about film music, talked about heavy metal, talked about favorite 25 essential and even 25 more essential classical pieces you should know. Some of my favorite jazz pieces. Those were fun episodes. I will not be doing any more podcast episodes of that type. Not talking about music itself. It's fun, and I may find some other places to do that. It may be something I talk about occasionally on my YouTube channel, or I may even come back to using my blog more. But and it may be just social media posts here and there, but it will not be as part of the podcast, not as the podcast Musicianship Mastery. I also am not going to be talking any more about music business. And my main reason for that is I really love talking about music business, but that is a topic that is well represented in the podcast landscape. There are so many podcasts that not only talk about it, but that's mainly what they talk about. And they do a much better job, I think, than I could do. And the guests that I would have on here, they are also on those podcasts. So if you ever have any question at all about music business, send me a message. Go to davidlanemusic.com and send me a message, and I will be happy to direct you to many podcasts that you can go check out for good business skills, marketing skills, and so forth. There are also several episodes that I've done already. I'm not deleting any of my past episodes. This is a rebrand going forward. I'm not going to delete a single episode that's already out there. I'm also going to be talking less, but not, I'm not going to avoid the topic, but I'm going to be talking less about pedagogical skills, so teaching. So there will not be any specific episodes about teaching. However, it may come up in conversation when we're talking about music, of working with students. And, you know, even if you're not thinking about being a teacher, you could be thinking about you are a student. So you can flip that around and kind of realize some things that you can do to be a better student whenever you're hearing something about being a better teacher. And then, as much as I love doing them, and I've done a lot of these episodes lately, going to be talking less about mindset, general goals. I've really enjoyed it, and I don't think I'll be able to help myself. I'll probably throw one of those out every now and then, but that is something that I think is going to be more prevalent on my YouTube channel. But I have done a lot of those episodes already, and I definitely encourage you to check them out. Last several episodes before this had to do with mindset or had to do with goals. So one more item of celebration on this podcast before I tell you some other things that you need to expect going forward, some important things I want to tell you. But since I talked about the types of episodes that I'm not going to be doing as much of, I thought it would be fun to share my favorite episodes that I would encourage you to go listen to anyway, that are unlike episodes I'm going to be doing going forward. So the first one is episode 8 from February 13th, 2023, The Craft of John Williams with Frank Lehman. That was my first conversation with him. It was actually intended to be the only one, but we got so into talking about 2 of the scores that we didn't leave enough time to talk about Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. But we came back and did a May 4th sequel, episode 20, The Empire Strikes Back, The Greatest Score. So that's the last time I talked about film music, and that was with Frank Lehman, and it is really fascinating, and I loved every bit of it. But, you know, won't be doing any more episodes quite like that. As I mentioned, I talked about 25 essential classical pieces to know. I actually got feedback that was helpful for a lot of you. And it pains me to make decisions that maybe I won't be doing episodes like this before, but I think I will find ways to get that information out there. It just won't be on this podcast itself. But that was episode 17 that came out on April 17th. And I believe it was about a year later. Yes, it was almost a year later. It was April 1st of this year, 2024, episode 68, that I talked about 25 more essential classical pieces you should know. There's a 2-part series of episodes that I greatly enjoyed. It's episodes 24 and episodes 25, came out on May 29th and June 5th of 2023. And it was Heavy Metal 101, Part 1 and Part 2, with Eric Schwartz. And Eric Schwartz has a great podcast, as I mentioned, and if you like heavy metal, you may want to go check it out. It's called Heavy Metal 101. But we looked at the entire genre, and we talked about how it ticks, and it's a really very comprehensive look at heavy metal, the genre. And it was a very fun episode, a very fun pair of episodes. And the numbers on that are pretty good. So a lot of you did check that out, but there will not be any more episodes like that going forward. And of course, I really recommend, again, I'm not going to be doing much of business or talking about teaching, so that's a double whammy on this one. It's episode 69, The Business Side of Private Teaching with Andrea Miller. Came out on April 8th of this year, 2024. Definitely, if you are teaching and you want to be a successful teacher in terms of business, it's definitely an episode you should check out. And then right after that, I interviewed Brian Witkowski on episode 71, and it was called Creating Value as an Entrepreneurial Musician. And I really enjoyed that episode because we took this concept that you hear a lot about, like how you need to raise your rates. This is something that musicians are told all the time by coaches, but his approach is, and what we talk about is not just raise your rates, but what are things that you can do that make raising your rates something that you can feel confident about. You can justify it, and it's little added incentives, or what you might call VIP incentives, that you can offer clients. Again, it's a great episode. I would highly recommend you check it out. It came out on April 22nd, 2024, episode 71. And obviously there's a few others, but these are just ones that came to mind. Okay, so let's talk about one more big announcement for this podcast going forward. As I said at the very beginning, we got to 100 episodes in 99 weeks. Not a single Monday was skipped between January 2nd, 2023 and November 11th of 2024. I've already said that streak is going to break next week. No more episodes for the rest of this year. Also, when I come back, the new frequency of this podcast is going to be way less than once a week. It's going to be kind of irregular. My goal, my intention, and it's not my promise, but it's my intention to say definitely once a month is what I'm shooting for. Now, there may be some shorter episodes. There may be some circumstances by which I might have more than one episode in a month. But I really, in my mind, I'm thinking I want to do my best to make sure that there are at least 12 new episodes in 2025, possibly more, but I'm willing to commit to a goal of getting out one new episode per month. I don't know what week that'll be. I assume it'll still be on a Monday. It's something I'm not quite positive of yet, but I hope to be much better than I have been at social media, and I will not just tell you that an episode has come out, but I will tell you a few days in advance, and hopefully more than once, when an episode is about to come out. Now, anytime something like this happens, when, going from what has been nearly 2 full years of once a week to going about this less, I feel like I should tell you a little bit about what influenced this decision. And part of me is really bothered by this. One of the things that one episode I did not include because it did get a lot of listenership, and it is the type of episode we'll be talking about. It was toward the beginning of this year, and it was a conversation I had with Melissa Slocum about goals themselves, goals for musicians. And one of the things that came up, and Melissa Slocum has been a personal coach in my own life, and so I've heard her say this outside of my interview many times, and that is, it's very tempting to hear what gurus say online, what a lot of your experts say on any certain thing, and you can almost take that message as if to say, I'm a failure if I don't do this, and sometimes I'm afraid, that people will take that from this podcast, that something that I say is some kind of gospel, when it's not. It's just something that's influenced by my experience that I'm offering as advice that may or may not work for you. Well, one of those things that you hear or read or watch, depending on where you go to find it, that you can find quite a bit, is this advice for podcasters that you have to be consistent. You have to put out an episode once a week, or whatever you establish as the norm, it has to always continue that way. Well, what Melissa has told me and what has reminded me of is what works for other people doesn't always have to be what you take for yourself. You have to consider your own situation, your own reality, and your own goals whenever you're hearing any advice like that. So recently, I have started a new church job. It is a part-time job, but it is a part-time job with considerably more hours than the job that I had when I started this podcast. And yes, I could keep this podcast going once per week, but besides the church job, I'm also teaching. I also do a lot of composing, arranging, and recording projects. And I also have made a little bit of traction on YouTube with piano and composer specific and even mindset specific videos. And I really like doing all of them. I have thought about, how can I eliminate any of them? And I can't. But what I can do is I can do less. Actually, have reached a point in my teaching where I've had to tell prospective students, that I don't have any spots, that I have a waiting list. And, that's a good problem to have. I hope it kind of continues to be the situation where I'm filling vacancies from a waiting list and not trying so hard to get new students. But one of the reasons for that is that I have eliminated a few slots. I am not teaching as much as I have in the past. I've thought about eliminating some of the composing and recording projects that I've done and saying no to that more often. But one of the episodes that I did, and I really should have included this, this was an oversight, not talking about this episode on ones that you should check out that not many people did. And in fact, the numbers are very low on this. I don't know why it did so poorly, but I think the information I share it's actually informing part of the decision for this podcast. And it was episode 79. It came out on June 17th of this year, 2024. And it was called Never Forget Your Main Thing as a Musician. So my main things, I guess, are composing, arranging, recording, creating original music, arranging other people's music. This is something that I do pretty well, and I feel like much less of a person if I don't do that. So this is something that I have to do as I'm going forward. I have to make time for those projects, and they do take time when they happen. And then YouTube. So I had one video. I've had a video last year that got 21,000 views, and it got a lot of feedback on it. But then I did one in August of this year that has gotten over 60,000 views as of this recording, and most of that happened pretty quickly, and a lot of just incredible feedback. And I realized that is something that I can't give that up. I can't do the once a week advice for YouTube that they also give. I can't do that either because again, it's just hard to do all of these different things and make a lot of traction. And common sense tells me I should give up something instead of trying to just do several things on an infrequent basis. And I may change my mind. I may have to revisit this decision later on. So, the things that I'm talking about the podcast going forward, that is the intent as of now, we'll have to see, what priorities are high, medium, and low in maybe a few months from now. I'm fine to revisit things on a quarterly basis. So why I'm not going to be continuing with this podcast once a week? That was a complicated first answers. Just I have too many things in my life. And one of the things I tried to do earlier this year was create a master calendar. Take 168 hours in a week. Fill in fixed times like for sleeping, for teaching, for eating 3 meals a day, for getting in workouts, for taking time to read, to and all the things that I need to do. Finding where do I do them, and that's where I realized I had a real math problem. If I was going to try to do a YouTube video even every other week while trying to do a podcast episode every week. So the second reason is, and this is just behind the scenes peek at what goes on. If you are listening to a podcast that's been going on for a long time and they've never missed a week, you can be sure of one of two things. One is that they don't have as many other side projects as I just mentioned that are competing for their time and their schedule. The other thing is that they probably have an assistant. I don't have an assistant, and I never have as a podcaster. I also, my YouTube channel is monetized, the podcast as a whole is not. Now I have other things I'm going to be working on, and may possibly come up with some type of membership or some type of, if not Patreon, some other option down the line that I might be able to offer that would provide a means of getting some support. I do not plan to run, what are called dynamic ads on this podcast, mainly because I just hate that as a listener. That happens on my YouTube channel, and if there was a better way to go about that, I would find some other way of doing it. But podcasts, you don't have to, and there's other ways to get a little money back for the time put in and the expenses that go into putting out a podcast. But if I had an assistant, if I had someone who did the editing, did the promo, and all I had to do was come up with the episodes and record them, that would be a way of doing more episodes. And so that's why I wanted to say anything is possible from this point. I'm planning to do one episode a month. There may come a time where I say that I really have to put more resources into YouTube or other avenues, and that I really can't do much with this podcast. But maybe I get a situation where I do get an assistant, or I come up with a system that just allows me to do episodes faster, but still have them be good quality episodes. And then maybe I'd go back to doing 2 episodes a month, or 3, or even more than that. There's a lot of possibilities going forward. I just want to say for now, expect about 1 episode a month. And then the last thing that has affected this decision, and as I've mentioned before, I haven't mentioned it overly often, I hope, but this is the second podcast. And when I started it, I had intended to have 2 active podcasts, but quickly realized that that was one thing I did learn. I could not do this once a week and even have any kind of other podcast. But I have wanted to reactivate my first podcast. That podcast is called Life in the Pit, and it is a very niche podcast. It is all about theater musicians in musical theater, people who play instruments in musicals, basically. And it's been a very good podcast. One of the reasons I went to this podcast is that podcast became too broad. I started talking about things that weren't related to the pit. And so that podcast go back to being super niche. It too will be once a month, and I'll go ahead and say there's almost no chance it'll be more often than once a month, because all of the episodes there, unlike here, will be entirely guest driven. I will not be doing any episodes that don't include guests, and I already have a couple of guests lined up to take care of January and February. So if you are interested in musical theater, you definitely want to check that out. And just to keep it separate, I will not be talking about musical theater here. And again, that's going to happen in January. So that's a lot of stuff. And I'm doing this episode with mixed emotions. I wish I could come on and just tell you all the changes with I'm perfectly fine with my decision to be a little more niche I do like the new name, Musicianship Mastery, more than I really liked the Musician Toolkit. But I wish I could tell you about those changes and how it's going to continue to be a weekly episode. But again, at this point in time, it's just not possible. But it might not always be impossible. There are things that could change with my situation down the road. But I've thought about this for most of the year, because you could hear me talking about possible changes to episode 100 all the way back on in the late 60s. But ultimately I decided that the things in my life, I don't want to get rid of all of them. I want to keep everything and try to make it all work. And I can do that if I don't try to do too much of one thing. So again, that may prove to be a bad decision, and we'll see what that leads me to down the road. But I'm going to give this a try for now. So both Life in the Pit and both this new podcast, or this rebranded podcast called Musicianship Mastery, will continue to go, just not as frequently as either one had been in their prime. So if you have feedback based on any aspect of this podcast, any episode ever, or anything that I've said today, nothing pleases me more than hearing from you, whether it's with your own voice at speakpipe.com/musician toolkit, which that will stay the website that you can leave a voice message on for now. I will certainly change that at some point in 2025. And if you're catching this episode later and you're wondering, wait, what is it now? It'll be on the show notes, whatever that episode is. It'll whatever that platform is, it will be on the show notes of every episode going forward. And then, of course, as always, and not going to change, you can go to davidlanemusic.com and leave me a message on the contact form. It's on the homepage. And again, tell me what's on your mind. You can tell me what kind of topics you would like for me to talk about more, and I'll be happy to tell you. If I don't think it fits this podcast, I'll tell you if it's something that I can do and what format I'll be doing it, and of course make sure that you know when I get around to doing it. So that is going to wrap up episode 100 of the Musician Toolkit. This is saying goodbye to the Musician Toolkit and hello to Musicianship Mastery. So I will be back with you again in January of 2025. Until then, thank you so much for listening.